operate with modest levels of grassland biodiversity, representing much of the UK's species pool's semi-natural grassland. Jerry currently serves as chairman of the Ecological Continuity Trust, a unique charity dedicated to preserving the national resource of long-term ecological field experiments across the UK. So without further ado, here's Jerry, and we're very lucky to have him with us this evening. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you, Sophie, for that introduction. Now, what I plan to do in the next 30 minutes is to take you on a virtual tour through meadows to just really show you how special they are. Now, the plan of my talk is, in fact, just let me make sure. Why am I not getting it to show? There we go. Right. The plan of my talk is, first of all, what I'll do is give you some definitions of what a meadow is and other types of grasslands. I'm not to go into the sort of detailed nature conservancy definitions, but more general ones. Then I will talk about the status of the grasslands and particularly the flower-rich meadows that you're interested in. I'll then go on to talk about key constraints on maintaining or creating flower richness in meadows. And at the end, what I'll do is talk about why flower richness in grasslands is so important. So what is a meadow? Well, traditionally, meadows were grasslands that were allowed to grow throughout the spring and early summer and then cut for hay in midsummer, which is generally July through to mid-August. And then they should have been, and they should be, grazed, but in the present day, quite a lot now get cut again. But I recommend, where possible, they should be grazed. I put in the word haylage there, which some people may not be familiar with. Haylage is actually a much moister form of conserved grass. So to put you sort of into the picture of the differences between hay, haylage, and what is widely used now, which is silage. Hay should have a moisture content when it's baled of no more than 15%. And the reason for that is that if the moisture content is significantly above 15%, then once the hay is baled and then packed into a barn, bacterial fermentation starts to go on and heats up the hay, and you can get a barn fire. So there's a real issue with keeping hay or making hay at a lower moisture content than 15%. Whereas haylage, which is cut at the same time as hay, can have a moisture content of say 40 to 50%. It's then wrapped and compressed very tightly into bales, and it undergoes what's called an anaerobic fermentation, a little bit like say sauerkraut, but nevertheless it's pickled, and that preserves it under acidic anaerobic conditions through the winter months when it will be fed to livestock. Silage, on the other hand, is cut and then fairly quickly put into clamps or into big bales, and its moisture content can be anywhere between 60 and 70%. Again, it then undergoes an anaerobic digestion to conserve it. Now, I give those things, those details to you because clearly hay in our unpredictable climate is a preferred means of conserving flourish meadows, but often when you've got prolonged periods of wet conditions, then it has to go into haylage. And there's no problem with that, with producing haylage. It's just that it has to be treated in a different way for livestock. So here's a picture, just to get you into the mood. Here's a picture of a northern hay meadow in Yorkshire, the Yorkshire Dales. Beautiful meadow, and as you can see into this picture, the grassland is dominated by red clover and buttercups. In fact, the species number in this meadow is not that great. It's between 10 and 15 species. And that is probably typical of a lot of our hay meadows, where there's been some applications of farmyard manure to boost the yields for the hay cut. But now, just to show you what an incredible hay meadow can look like, this particular hay meadow contained between 40 and 50 species. And I have to come clean because This was a meadow that I was working on in Croatia. But to actually reassure you that many of our chalk and limestone meadows contain upwards of 40 species as well. And look, not unlike this one. And the great thing about this particular meadow was that it was a noisy place to work in. It was full of grasshoppers and crickets. And I must admit, one of the most delightful things I saw was, in fact, a praying mantis actually capturing Adonis blue butterflies, literally 6 inches from my nose. Anyway, a remarkable place, absolutely wonderful. But now to sort of bring us back down to earth, what typifies most of our agricultural landscape are scenes like this. This is a typical silage field with no more than 3, or if you're lucky, 4 species in it. And this scene is now right across the lowland UK, very species poor, impoverished grasslands. Now, I just show this picture because Devon is actually really lucky in having a wonderful resource, particularly in North Devon and Mid Devon, of what we call fen meadows. And these are meadows that develop on poorly drained soils in valley bottoms, which contain a wonderful array of species and also very important for really rare butterflies, such as the marsh fritillary and other creatures. They're called a meadow, and they were in the past cut late summer, and the cut material was often used for bedding of all things, but not for feeding generally. But nowadays, because of the difficulties of making hay on this wet ground, they are generally grazed by either cattle or ponies. Now, that actually makes it difficult to classify them as a meadow, as I'll talk to you in a moment about the classification of grazed-only grasslands. And another meadow is of the water meadows. Again, meadows of river valleys, stream valleys, and water meadows were actually in existence since at least the 16th century, the Middle Ages. And they were amongst the most economically valuable parts of the farmland because the meadows were flooded during the winter months. Silt, organic rich silt brought in, flooded onto these meadows, which fertilized them, and they provided a consistently good hay crop, which in turn was fed to the livestock. And the livestock then produced manures, which actually fertilized the cropland. And as I say, they were actually the most economically valuable parts of the farming system, fetching very high rent values up to the turn of the last century. And then with the advent, the discovery of chemical fertilizers, they became obsolete. And now they exist largely as nature reserves. So the Upper Thames Valley has a wonderful resource of hay meadows. And along the Wye Valley, there were also the lug meadows, which unfortunately intensive farming, chicken farms and others have really compromised them. But as I say, these wonderful meadows still survive in parts of the UK, but from an agricultural sense, they're largely obsolete. Talking of obsolete pictures, this is a scene that I witnessed, but is now so rare. And this actually shows why in the past, hay meadows were both culturally and socially important. And this is where the Moors Meadow Group comes in to its strength, because the Moors Meadow Group is a bastion of preserving some of the cultural heritage of these meadows. But I just put that picture in. And now, to the downside of managing a meadow, the ground surface needs to be flat. And the reason for that is any molehills or anthills or uneven ground will provide the risk of getting soil into the cut hay or haylage. And the presence of soil provides a high risk of the silage or haylage being fed to the animals, or hay being fed to the animals, and giving them either Clostridia or Listeriosis because of the bacterial multiplication due to the soil contamination. So that's one of the big problems that meadow management actually causes flat ground. And I just give you a picture here of a wonderful area of grassland full of anthills. And the anthills were both unique micro habitats for low-growing shrubs such as thymes and rock roses, but also it's been found that these anthills provided benefits such as in enhancing soil fertility and enhancing fungal communities as well. So all sorts of advantages with having anthills and this structural heterogeneity. Here's another one where the mounds, the tussocks, were really good for mosses and lichens as well. And you can see a lot of bare ground there, which would be a good place for solitary bees to burrow into. Now, these anthill covered grasslands were all managed by grazing. And this gives the second class that I want to define for you. Pastures are grasslands that are primarily grazed through the summer. So meadows are primarily cut through the summer, and pastures are grazed through the summer. So it's just a case of defining what you mean when you say, oh, I saw a wonderful pasture, then I associate that with grazing animals. And in the bottom right-hand picture, you can see a wonderful meadow. I say wonderful because it's structurally heterogeneous. You can see tall grass and patches of short grass, really good for invertebrates. And now, these wood pastures, they were first described and recognized as being important by a wonderful Dutch ecologist, Frans Vera, who proposed that wood pastures were actually the primary vegetation or climax vegetation that developed in the post-glacial era up to the time when man really left his imprint on the landscape. And wood pastures are a mixture of glades created by large herbivores, such as these wonderful longhorn cattle, which I have a great affinity for. They're wonderful animals, but they created glades in the woodland, which associated with the scrub and the mature trees around them, are amongst the most biodiverse ecosystems within Europe. And also where you have rewilding that is really successful. This is probably what you should be targeting to achieve. Wood pastures. Now, okay, this is the dry bit of the talk, some definitions. And I know people get confused by people saying, oh, I've got improved grassland or semi-natural improved grassland. Improved grassland is grassland that has been modified for agricultural production through drainage, through fertilizer and through reseeding. And its current management is primarily for agricultural production. In the jargon of ecosystem services, it's got a primary function. That's producing meat or milk or wool. And these grasslands have, because of their management and because of the fertilizer that applied to them, have very limited scope for increased biodiversity. And when I talk about limited scope, I showed you the slide of the silage field with probably no more than 3 grass species present in it. Very limited and probably no real scope for increasing the biodiversity. Semi-natural improved grasslands have been in the past modified for agricultural production, but today they have shifted their management towards more traditional management such as hay cutting or conservation grazing that I talked about in a previous talk. They are valuable grasslands with naturally occurring flora and some are really species rich. So they are potentially really valuable and in many cases have become really valuable for biodiversity. Down in the bottom are semi-natural unimproved grasslands. They've never been improved for agricultural production. They've been managed with traditional techniques and they are amongst the most species-rich grasslands that fall within the category of grasslands or species-rich grasslands. They are really the jewels in our landscape for biodiversity. Wonderful places. But just a few rather sobering figures here. UK land area cover. Improved grasslands cover just over 30% of our land area. Semi-natural grasslands, which I've just talked about, cover less than 10%. Semi-natural, unimproved grasslands, these are the jewels in our crown, cover just 2%. And the really flower-rich grasslands, just 1%. It's really an abysmally small amount. And then if I show you this pie chart showing the estimated extent of semi-natural grassland habitats in the UK, the vast majority, over 85%, are the upland acid grasslands, of which we have quite a large proportion on Dartmoor. And right down at the bottom of the pie chart, at 0.7% are hay meadows. They really are rare. They are sort of the red listed habitats of the UK. And you can see, again, relatively small, very small amounts of things like lowland calcareous grassland or upland calcareous grassland as well. So this is a sobering picture of really how precious hay meadows are within our landscape. Okay, I said in my plan of the talk, I was going to talk about some of the constraints on maintaining or creating plant species richness within grasslands. And this graph shows you on the left-hand axis is the number of species per meter squared. That's a standard that botanists generally use for measuring diversity in grasslands. And along the bottom axis is the total amount of nitrogen fertilizer, but also including atmospheric inputs as well, that the grasslands were receiving. And you can see very clearly that below 50 kilograms per hectare, that is where you get your most species rich. And in fact, the most species rich meadows occur at very low levels of nitrogen inputs. And just to give you a context for that, the critical nitrogen amount for species rich meadows, such as the one in the picture here, that one that I showed you before, is less than 15 kilograms per hectare per year in total. Now, considering that atmospheric inputs probably in most of the UK are approaching 15 kilograms per hectare anyway, it shows we've got a real problem on our hand, particularly if any farmer or landowner wants to add a little bit of fertilizer. It isn't possible in order to maintain that species richness. I showed you the picture of the nitrogen graph. I could also show you the same figure or looking figure with phosphorus. Phosphorus levels within grasslands, and particularly within species-rich grassland, incredibly low. And if people are familiar with the sort of index, the soil index, which you get when you get your land analyzed by the fertilizer manufacturers, they will talk about an index of 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. The higher the figure, the more plant available nutrients there are. With phosphorus, under really species-rich meadows, it's generally a 0 to the lower 1, but generally a 0. And that is very important because once you have added phosphates to a grassland soil, it's very difficult to remove them, and it's a long-lasting effect or legacy that you will be facing. Now, species-rich unimproved grasslands are important for 38% of the UK's Biodiversity Action Plan priority species. And I've just shown 3 here as examples: the skylark, a frog orchid, and the wall butterfly. Now, they are important, but I know that many of you want to create or improve your grasslands for species richness or flower richness. And what we did with colleagues from the British Trust for Ornithology, Reading University, and Rothamsted Research at North Wyke is we reviewed all the plants which can survive in low to modest levels of soil fertility. And we wanted to classify them according to their value for, in the first column, total number of associated invertebrates. Those are invertebrates, insects, and pollinators and such like, that use either the pollen, the nectar, or the seeds, or the vegetation, the leaves, or the stems of those plants. And as you can see at the top, we have bird's foot trefoil, lucerne, black medic, sainfoin, lesser trefoil, and red clover. All of these are members of the legume family. For the botanists amongst you, they're the Fabaceae now, so that we don't call them legumes now, but for simplicity's sake, they're all legumes, they all fix nitrogen. If you go along to the next column, which says total numbers of associated PSA birds, PSA stands for Public Service Agreement. And it's not my phrase at all. It's the one that policymakers use. But Public Service Agreement birds, or PSA birds, consist of the skylark, yellowhammer, corn bunting, lapwings. Those are the sort of birds that we're talking about. And grey partridge as well, which are incredibly rare now in Devon, as are all the other birds in lowland agricultural landscape. And if you look down the next columns, you'll see either 3 pluses, 2 pluses, or 1 pluses. Those just signify the value or importance of these different species to either livestock or the potential for soil restructuring, which is now really important when a lot of our soils have had their structures damaged by either intensive management in the past or heavy stocking rates that have been applied. So going down that list again, you can see there's some clear, real priority species to introduce, such as red clover, such as ribwood plantain, common sorrel, really, really good for invertebrates, the numbers of invertebrates. So I give you this slide here just to give you an idea of sort of target species that you need to be reintroducing into your grasslands if you have inherited rather impoverished grasslands. Okay, now this slide actually mirrors what I showed you for nitrogen inputs. On the left-hand axis is the number of flower heads in a 10-meter square area, and that is basically the amount of pollen and nectar available to the butterflies, bees, bumblebees, and hoverflies. And along the bottom is the amount of fertilizer nitrogen that has been applied to the meadows. This was data that was taken from a big survey that myself and colleagues did. And the EXT at the top stands for extensively managed grasslands. The middle, moderate or moderately managed, or moderately intensively managed, and then of course intensive, which is largely the intensive dairy systems. And again, you can see that below 50 kilograms is where all of our extensive grasslands were present, and they were the ones which were supplying really high levels of pollen and nectar for our butterflies, bees, bumblebees, and hoverflies. And when you look along the bottom line of increasing fertilizer, you can see that apart from the odd creeping thistle, there's very little, virtually no pollen and nectar resources in most of our grassland. This figure here shows you invertebrate species richness, depending on the flowering plant species richness. It's a very clear relationship. And what I put on the left-hand axis is herbivore species, and this includes things like grasshoppers, crickets, aphids, weevils, and such like. And there you have on the bottom axis flower species richness, a very clear relationship between herbivore species richness and our flower species richness. And this is data which was provided by friends of mine, Ben Woodcock and Richard Pywell, from the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and it was published by them. Pollinator abundance, and again I show you a picture of a bumblebee on the left-hand side. So pollinator abundance relative to the amount of availability of flowers and herbs within your grassland. Again, a very clear picture of an increasing relationship between pollinator abundance and increasing abundance. Percentage cover is a scientific term we use, but it basically is abundance of flowers and herbs within our grassland. Now, this I'm going to talk you through an interesting way of looking at the value of grasslands for, in this case, the pollinator and nectar feeding guild of invertebrates. And we have an old permanent pasture dominated by grasses, but also with maybe white clover present in it. And what it shows on the bottom line is the plant species, the top line, the number of pollinator species. For simplicity's sake here, and this is actually from genuine data that was gained by my colleagues, there are 3 species along the bottom, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 species along the top in an old permanent pasture. And then I mentioned we're trying to improve grassland botanical diversity. And what we did was we tested either a grass-only mix as a control that relates to your silage fields, and then a grass plus legume mix, which had red clover and vetches and trefoils in that one. And then the bottom figure will be a mixture containing both grasses, the legumes, that's the clovers, and flowers. And the sort of flowers we're talking about, again, ribwort plantain, sorrel, black knapweed, and oxeye daisy. So here's what we call a food web, and it shows the connections that are actually observed by our entomologists between the plant species and those invertebrates that actually fed on them or depended on them. And you can say 3 grass species and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 invertebrates that were utilizing that particular grass meadow. And here we have a grass clover mix, and you can see the complexity of the network of invertebrates that feed on more than one of the plant species. So, for example, red clover has lots of nectar and pollen feeders associated with it, as do many of the legumes, as I showed you previously in that slide. And then for a really complex relationship, you would just add in the flowers. And there you can see what we call a trophic or food web of all the connections between different plant species and between the invertebrates along the top here. Now, what I'm going to talk about next is what happens when you simplify your grasslands or your meadows. So here we have on the left-hand side a grass only, 3 species of grasses, and they might be ryegrass, Italian ryegrass, and a hybrid which is called a festoon lowland, which is commonly what most of our silage fields contain. And there might be the odd creeping thistle in there, but very, very much they are dominated by just these 3 grasses. And then on the right, we have our grass and clover and wildflower mix grassland with all of the complex relationships between the plants and the bees, bumblebees, hoverflies at the top. What happens if we remove just one of those species of grass? Well, if I go back, you can see we've lost one of the invertebrate species, which is able to utilize that particular meadow. Okay, what happens if we just take out one more? Just go back. So we're taking out one more. Just watch that top column on the right-hand side and see whether you can spot whether we lose any of the pollinator species. No. And here's the consequence, the catastrophe for the invertebrates. These very simplified silage fields or intensively grazed fields with very limited in the way of pollinators guilds being able to utilize them, whereas when you have relatively simple mix of grasses and clovers and flowers, you have a very much more robust system that supports so much more. Now, Professor Jane Memmott at Bristol University came up with a conceptual analysis initially, but it's been borne out through experimentation of what are the consequences of plant species loss in terms of secondary extinctions of pollinators. It's called the extinction risk analysis. And on the left-hand slope, you have extinction slope, and the lower figure, the one which is just above 1 on that side, which relates to the grass system, the silage fields, that has a high extinction risk, whereas the one which is GL stands for grasses and legumes or clovers, and the grass, legume and flowers, those have a much higher point on the slope, and that means it has a much lower extinction risk. So the inclusion of clovers and flowers within your grasslands actually gives greater resilience to the pollinator communities and lowers the extinction risk. And that is really fundamental to why meadows, species-rich meadows, are so important for buffering the effects of climate change within our landscape, and why your efforts, where you have been able to create some greater diversity within your grasslands, is so important for reversing the biodiversity losses throughout our agricultural landscape. And that's probably quite a rapid run through or virtual tour of meadows and why they're important. But I thought it would give you plenty of opportunity to fire questions and comments at me. So thank you very much for listening.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much, Jerry. That was fascinating. And I'm sure I'm not the only one in wishing that was double the length. I feel like we just got going into some really amazing topics there. And I must apologise for my butchering of the pronunciation of North Wyke.
Don't worry.
Apologies to anyone from there. My brain sort of stopped when I read that out. But we're going to move on with the other talks now, but I'm sure there are lots of questions for Jerry. So please do make the most of the comment section, and we'll make sure that we answer as many as we can towards the end of the session. But for now, I'm really thrilled to introduce Lisa, who's the project manager of the Big Devon Meadows Count, and Lisa's going to tell us a bit more about that. So over to you, Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and thank you as well, Jerry, for a very comprehensive presentation covering a huge range of topics in such a short time. I'm here to tell you a little bit about the Devon Big Meadows Count, which is also called the Big Devon Meadows Count. And I don't think it really matters which way round you are, because Devon is quite big. And also, we are being quite ambitious with our work here. So this is all exciting stuff. Now, I've got a little presentation here that I need to try to bring up. Bear with. Aha, here it is. So the Devon Big Meadows Count is a project that I have been involved in last year and coming into this year as well. I'm project managing it for More Meadows. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the overview of the project. And then I'm going to pass to Jack Rivers, who is the ecologist working on the project from Devon Biodiversity Records Centre. And he's going to outline a little bit more about county wildlife sites and also about the detail of the survey that is involved in the project. So it's a 2-year project. We had a kind of mini tryout phase last year for the Big Meadows Count, but the big rollout of the project is this year. And today is the launch of that, which is very exciting. The project is a partnership between More Meadows and the Biodiversity Records Centre in Devon, which is the holder of nature records par excellence, housed within Devon Wildlife Trust. And the project is funded by the Devon Environment Foundation. We did receive a small amount of funding as well from the Dartmoor National Park Authority last year to do with their Dartmoor's Dynamic Landscapes project, but the majority of our funds come from Devon Environment Foundation. And the project covers all of Devon, and it covers all More Meadows sites in Devon, and that's a lot of acreage, 2,700 acres across 575 sites. It's a lot of land that we're talking about covering here. Now, you may well know More Meadows, but I've been involved in More Meadows for a few years now, and I have to say it is an absolutely extraordinary organisation. If you haven't looked at the More Meadows website, please do, because it is an absolute wealth of information about grassland management, grassland open days. We've got over 2,000 members of More Meadows now. And It is a whole collective of enthusiasm for meadows and sharing of expertise for meadows and sharing of kit and of wildflower seed and all manner of other things right the way across Devon. This little map is the map that Moor Meadows owners can choose to have their sites represented on. And you can see the yellow are just over the border. I'm not getting territorial here at all. But you can see the green dots in the middle within Dartmoor and the spread out right the way across Devon of meadows across the landscape. And of course, this represents quite a lot of the different meadow types that Jerry has been talking about. Everything from upland hay meadows on Dartmoor through to slightly more basic meadows or culm grassland or floodplain meadow. There's all kinds of different habitat types represented here. One of the things about Moor Meadows that makes it really a unique organisation is that it is a collective of meadow owners that are not just farmers. There's everything here from large gardens right the way through to estates, small holdings, and people who just have a field and want to manage that for nature. And quite a lot of Moor Meadows sites here on the map are just represented by the pinpoint. We don't really have information other than this, other than the patchy information that Moor Meadows owners might have sent us in the past. And that's really interesting because particularly with grasslands, when you've got small sites, they could be even under 2 hectares, you've got a real lack of information about meadows in our landscape. On top of that, you've also got a real enthusiasm within the Moor Meadows project and with lots of other projects as well, such as ones that Devon Wildlife Trust has been running or ones that Plant Life has been running, where people are going out and recreating meadow sites. Everything from cropping land to get the nutrient level down and then re-establishing with wildflower seed, to using seed to increase the diversity of sites. There's a lot of action like this going on, and not a lot of it is recorded. And as those meadows develop, there isn't really an overview of when they might reach a certain level of species diversity or how they could be protected. So the information we've got is patchy, and the effort that can be put into helping protect those sites is also therefore patchy. And that is one of the big reasons why we have this project now, to try and record what is out there with Moor Meadows sites. I said it's big and ambitious. What we're trying to do with the Big Meadows Count is to get as many Moor Meadows owners as possible to survey your own meadows using a specially designed methodology. Now, to some people that might sound quite scary, to others that might sound a little simplistic, depending on where you are on the botanical survey scale. You might know an awful lot about 1 or 2 particular species on your meadow, but we're trying to use a methodology that everyone can actually access and use here relatively easily, where we can still get an idea of the quality and the species richness of the meadows. That data will be evaluated, and this allows Devon Biodiversity Records Centre to actually identify which of the meadows out there are actually of county wildlife site quality. So I think that's been described already as the icing on the cake, or the extra award. But that really means it's important at a county level. And it means that it could be afforded some level of protection through the planning process. And Jack will talk a little bit about that. So it may be that some meadows need to be referred for further survey, but ultimately what this will do is help us get as comprehensive a picture as possible of what is out there. So we've had our little trial. We're heading now to the rollout of the project. But before I tell you how we got on last year, why survey your meadow? What are the reasons for actually doing this survey, for getting all plant nerdy and starting to really get your quadrats out and get sorted? Well, to start with, it really does help improve species identification skills and survey skills. And this is something that I think a lot of people who are not trained as ecologists or haven't worked in conservation seems a bit scary. And we've put a lot of effort into trying to make the methodology as user-friendly as possible. But we've got a lot of training resources. We've got a lot of training days set up. And we're really wanting to support and assist more meadows owners to get their ID skills up with this survey, to learn more about your meadow as well, because of course the more you know about your meadow, the more you can fine-tune the management, the more you can think about how it's cut or how it's grazed, when that's done, which particular species are coming back in which particular areas and why. And of course that helps to value and protect your site as well. So the more information there is, the more you have at your fingertips to try and protect that site. County Wildlife Site designation is lovely because it does help give a little bit of protection for the site. And of course, there can be further improvements made, so everyone can keep trying to make the most of the biodiversity value of their meadows. And again, this may, depending on the size of your site and the circumstance, but it might help with getting into grant schemes in the future. I know that's a little sensitive now with things like SFI, but that kind of information is always useful to help get funding, to help manage that site for conservation. So with the Big Meadows Count, we're being very ambitious. We would like to get a minimum of 200 sites surveyed by more meadows owners. Now, at the moment, we have 575 sites registered with the More Meadows Network in Devon. So that's quite a high proportion, relatively, of the sites. If we can get more than that, absolutely brilliant. And then the number of sites we're going to be able to number crunch will very much depend on the time and the resource that Devon Biodiversity Records Centre have to put into that within the year, juggling that with all their other projects. But that's our minimum. Now, we would like to identify a minimum of 10 new county wildlife site grasslands. That would be completely amazing. But also identify other habitat of interest. Of course, meadows don't happen in isolation. If there are areas of scrub or woodland or wetland here that are adjacent to the meadows that we find out about, so much the better. If there's species of interest that you know about, even if it's outside of the survey season that you're doing the survey in, so much the better. It's just getting as comprehensive a picture as possible. This project will also allow us to try out a new methodology for meadow survey, which has been specially designed with meadow owners in mind. And it could well be that that might be useful for others in different parts of the country who are nursing similar aspirations to try and get a better picture of what's going on out there with meadows. So results from last year. Now, we trialled 2 different areas on Dartmoor for last year. We had an area of search around Chagford, Morton Hampstead, which is where I'm talking to you from. And we also had another area around Widdicombe in the Moor. We ran a survey day with a couple of survey training sessions at Langford Meadows out near Letterford, North Bovey. And we tried out the methodology, we developed the information sheets and the information pack, we gathered all the data. The data could be sent in either electronically or as paper copies. The numbers were crunched, and we got a bit of an idea of a snapshot of a small area of Devon of how this project might work. But this is quite exciting. We got data back last year for 24 more meadows sites. I suspect from the feedback we've had and the little evaluation we did, we probably would have had more had it not been such a wretchedly wet summer. There were quite a few landowners who really wanted to do the survey, but the windows of time they had were a total washout. But of those 24 more meadows sites that were surveyed, 4 of them were immediately identified as county wildlife site quality on the basis of that survey alone. And there's a further 7 sites are potentially county wildlife site, but need a little bit more survey to make sure that that's underpinned by the data that's required for the designation of sites. That's a really high proportion of the total number of sites. And if I don't want to extrapolate that data too much because it's only a very small sample, but if we took that as an indication, it could be there's an awful lot of very high quality meadows out there that aren't known about. And that's really, really exciting. It could mean that there is a wildflower grassland resource out there in Devon, which could make a really, really big difference for nature. We did get a lot of feedback from the Moor Meadows owners who were involved in the project. Everything from the user friendliness of the species list to what can I make a quadrat out of, to all the information that was provided and how people got on. So that's all been ploughed back into the project, excuse the pun, and we've now got, hopefully, a new and improved methodology for this year. So our timeline, we're launching the project today, but survey doesn't begin until June. So we've now got a 2-month window for Moor Meadows owners to register. We are just putting the final touches to the programme of 6 different training days over Devon, and Jack and Hannah Gibbons and a few others are also working on species identification films. So we're getting all the resources together for everyone to make as good a go at the survey as they can. The survey period is from June until August. Now, a lot of meadows are going to be at their best in the latter part of June and the early part of July, but that's not always the case. Some culm grasslands, for example, could be much better July, August time. You know your meadows best. You know when they are at their best. But the survey data will be collected mainly electronically, which Jack will talk about in a minute. And we've got a system now where we can actually get that uploaded with the maps, which helps DBRC in crunching the data hugely. DBRC will look at the results as they come in, identify where the county wildlife site support is needed. We will also have a small band of surveyors who can help if people are really struggling to get their survey done for various reasons. But we would strongly encourage you to do your own survey if you can. Number crunching continues from September through to November, and we hope to have all the data reported on and published in December, along with a little celebration of our results. So that's roughly where we're at. We've got quite an exciting year ahead of us with the Big Meadows Count. There are some common question and answers about the project, and I'm not going to go into detail in these now because of time constraint, but we are producing a question and answer sheet as part of the whole survey effort. So do ask questions today, or give us a shout, either myself or Jack, or wait for that information pack to come through, and we can always provide you with the information you need. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand over to Jack for a bit more detail.
Thanks, Lisa. That was great, and very exciting times for the project. I'm really looking forward to seeing it all kick off. But without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Jack Rivers from the Devon Biodiversity Records Centre, who's going to tell us a bit more about that. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all this evening. Yep, that all looks like it's working. So I'm just going to introduce you all to Devon Biodiversity Records Centre, because I'm very conscious we're often working behind the scenes on lots of things and people aren't always familiar with us. And then I'm going to give a brief overview of the methodology we use for the Big Devon Meadows Count. So what is Devon Biodiversity Records Centre? Well, we're one of many local environmental record centres throughout the UK, which tend to be based at the county level. So we were originally set up 20 years ago, and the idea was that we would act as a central reference point for environmental data, and we've since then been providing information on wildlife and habitats continually. So currently we hold over 8.5 million records, and that's constantly being added to, with around 2,000 to 5,000 records uploaded each month. So we're hosted by Devon Wildlife Trust, and I'm conscious that that's not very clear in what it means. But essentially, we're part of the Devon Wildlife Trust umbrella, but we are independent and we're ran on a not-for-profit basis. So we don't actually receive any government funding, and therefore we do apply some charges to our data services, and that's in order to maintain our database, but also to continually improve our long-term holdings. And lots of our other funding will come through kind of licenses with partners such as Devon County Council and other environmental projects. So we're more than just a data holder and data provider. We're split into two teams. So we have a field team, which I'm a part of, and a very skilled technical team. We provide expert knowledge, whether that's mapping and drone work to detailed botanical surveys. If you did want to find out more about Devon Biodiversity Records Centre, then the best place to look is our website. So, how will the data that's collected through this project be used? So, the main priority for us is to provide Moor Meadows and DBRC with insight into the conditions and variety of grassland habitats within the Moor Meadows network, but Devon as a whole. But the idea as well is really to engage landowners and other surveyors with the meadows that they see daily, and also to get engaged with plant identification. So sites may be mapped as a priority habitat within our own data holdings, which is then shared with our partners and can also be incorporated into the planning process. So that can add some layer of protection to sites. If there are a development going on and it's mapped as priority habitat, then it would be flagged up. So species records may also be used in a similar way to this if you have particularly rare species on your site. And then, the other big thing is sites that meet high enough quality could potentially become county wildlife sites. Now, I'm conscious that people might not know what a county wildlife site is, but I'm going to give an overview of that in a second. So where sites could potentially meet county wildlife site survey, then we would be looking to do follow-up surveys. And then if it is then found to meet the county wildlife site criteria, then it could be designated. So what is a county wildlife site? I'm conscious I've not got too long to talk about this, so this is going to be a very brief overview. But at the end of this, if you're still really unsure, I am actually going to be doing a talk for Moor Meadows on the 1st of May, all about county wildlife sites. But the basic overview, county wildlife sites are sites that were nationally adopted in the 90s. And the aim was to raise the profile of wildlife sites and habitats that have really high biodiversity value, but they didn't benefit from statutory designations. So things like sites of special scientific interest. So they are non-statutory designations. And as a part of that, they don't restrict how the land is managed with landowners. However, if there are developments that could be perceived to impact upon them, then that should be flagged up in the planning process. So it adds a level of protection. So there is a strict criteria for county wildlife site designation, and that is available on our website if you wanted to review it. It's a fairly hefty document, but it is very interesting. But they are predominantly designated based on the presence of priority habitat or significant populations of protected species, so things that might be threatened or locally notable. So currently there are over 2,000 sites in Devon alone, and that's approximately 5% of the county. So yeah, quite a lot of sites, but this is continually being added to year on year. And that entire network is managed and ran by Devon Biodiversity Records Centre. So now on to the bit about conducting your surveys as part of the Big Devon Meadows Count. So what are the main steps? So the pre-survey steps are really important. So first of all, you need to register to take part in the Big Devon Meadows Count. That way we can see whereabouts you're based, and then we'll be able to send through all the documentation you need. So that will be instructions on the methodology, supporting materials for identification, and any other Q&A, various information that you'll need. Do keep an eye out for some of those events that Lisa mentioned. So the training events will be really important if you're not particularly confident in ID, or you just want to get more familiar with certain species and the methodology. But there's also going to be some more talks and some instructional videos. And then the other thing is definitely try and earmark a date to conduct your survey between June and August. The weather can be incredibly variable, so maybe set aside a fair bit of time. But typically surveys can range from a couple of hours, maybe a day. You might even have multiple sites, so pick times that are appropriate for the amount of meadows that you're planning to survey. So the equipment needed, we've tried to keep this really slimmed down. So you'll need the survey forms. You'll need a map or a boundary of your site, but that could literally just be a blank bit of paper that you sketch a basic boundary around. You'll need something to draw with, a clipboard to write on, a quadrat. Now, quadrats come in all shapes and sizes. We don't expect you to have a fancy scientific pre-made one. We recommend that you make one with some string, and you can pin those corners down. You can make it with bamboo, bits of pipe. You can get quite creative with them. Essentially, we just want something that's 1 meter squared and something that you can focus in on. You'll need a camera or a phone with a camera. So we like this so you can take pictures of your quadrats, so we can have a look at the species you're identifying and the composition of the quadrats. But also we ask that you take general pictures of your meadow so we can see the habitat at large. But the other great benefit with phones and modern technology is identification apps. So we do recommend a few different ones that you can use. I know the Botanical Society for Britain and Ireland did quite an interesting bit of research looking into the most sort of accurate apps. And I think that ones I tend to use are things like Flora Incognito. I think Google Lens is meant to be quite good. And I quite like PlantNet, although that's quite low down in the rankings. But if you don't want to use identification apps or other materials, if you've got a wildflower guide, that's brilliant. But there's no need to go out and buy one. But you can often pick them up in charity shops. Then basic things like suitable clothing, sun cream, insect repellent, prepare for the British weather, and then bring some food and drink. Now, another really important thing is to let someone know that you're going to be out surveying, and it can be useful to give them a time that you're expected to be out for. So, survey methodology. Now, due to time, can't go into too much detail, but this will be a brief sort of overview. So, what we want you to do is to choose a zigzag route across your site, which is a safe route that you can walk, but it should try and incorporate all different variations within your site. So going up steeper bits, lower bits, boggier bits, you try to incorporate as much as you can. So one thing to note is that the zigzag should try to be at least 3 meters away from the edge of your field. And this is because different plant assemblages tend to thrive in areas of shade along hedgerows, so it can add a bit of bias. But we're also conscious that this survey is open to people that might just have a garden meadow, or in some cases a rooftop meadow. So if you can't stay 3 meters away from the boundary, just try to stay as far away as kind of reasonable. So yeah, reduce that distance from the edge. So your walk should ideally cover the length of your meadow, and we ask that you stop at 10 random intervals throughout your walk and alternate which side you put your quadrat on. And this is just so we have a standardized approach. However, if you do have a smaller site and you don't think you can fit that in, then just place the quadrat at 10 random points throughout your meadow. So once you put down your quadrat, we ask that you take a picture and then measure a few important things for us. So one thing to note is the number of the quadrat. We recommend that bring a bit of paper with a number on it, and you can, when you take your picture, easily distinguish the order of your quadrats. But then the other measurements we ask are grassiness. So this is the total cover of grasses and white clover, just broad category. We ask for the coverage of bare ground and the average sward height. So by that is essentially the average height of the vegetation. So these measurements are really subjective, so try not to overthink it, but just do your best. So finally, we ask that you start recording the species within your quadrat. So we have a set list of around 70 indicator species. And it's best to start by just looking at the things you know, the easily observable species. And then once you're happy that you've recorded them, then you can start to part the vegetation and look for all the things that might be growing beneath. This can take up to 5 minutes. So have a good fertile through and make sure you kind of record as much as possible. So you then repeat that, placing a quadrat 10 times throughout your walk. And as you're walking along, you might also want to record additional species that occur outside the quadrat. There's a separate section where you could do that on the form. And yeah, the other thing to note is if you know your meadow really well and there's species that aren't there at present, then you can always look at those again and submit those separately. So why are we using a scientific method? So by using a standardized methodology, we can maintain consistency to make sure the data we collect is of good quality. By structuring the collection method, we can avoid bias in surveying, as people are likely just to head for the most rich part of their meadow, whereas we're trying to get an overall view of it. And then the other thing is, why are we using indicator species? And what is an indicator species? So essentially, these are plants that are indicative of certain habitat types and habitat conditions. But by having a set list of those, it reduces the need to be able to ID absolutely everything. And I think there's only 1, maybe 2 grass species. So it's mostly flowering forbs and kind of more broadleaf plants. And then finally, by using a quadrat, it really helps focus your eye in, so you're not getting distracted, and it can help with some of those general estimations. So submitting your data this year, we've designed an online form, which will be launched ready for the survey season. We really would like you to use this online form. We're going to be making a video as to how to use it. And then if you are really struggling, then do get in contact with us and we can either help you out or receive your data another way. This online form feeds the data back to us in a nice structured way, so it should streamline the analysis. And then where sites do meet county wildlife site criteria, we will put those forward for designation later in the year. And where they're potentially borderline, we'll try and get in contact to organise a follow-up survey. So things to look out for in the next few weeks and months. So more online talks, those in-person training sessions. Once you've registered, we're going to be sending out supporting documents at staggered times. So you won't receive things immediately, but they will be sent out in waves. And then finally, those instructional videos. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening. And if you are keen to sign up and take part, then you can follow that link below. And I believe the link is also in the chat. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Jack. That was really exciting, I think. And thank you for making it feel so accessible as well. And just as an immediate call to action after Jack's talk and a great way to get involved, we'd love to invite you again to register for the Big Meadow Count via the More Meadows website. So make sure you make a note of that. Now, we have, luckily, 20 minutes for a Q&A session, and I'm really looking forward to this. We've had some brilliant questions for our excellent speakers. Now, I've grouped them into various themes, and I think one that I'd love to begin with comes from Rachel, and I think I'm going to direct this straight back to Jerry, if that's okay, Jerry. Now, this, I think, was thinking back to your point about the importance of flat terrain and the lack of it in Devon. It's quite a hilly county, isn't it? Now, Rachel asks, if the meadow to be is on a sloped incline, does that mitigate against attempts to transform it into a meadow?
No, no, absolutely not. I mean, the biggest problem, again, is what you inherit in terms of the soil fertility. That is the biggest problem with actually creating diverse meadows. And if there's been a history of a farmer previously or landowner previously applying fertilizer or even, say, planting conifers on that meadow, that'll change the soil fertility, particularly with conifers. So it's really the history of the site that dictates what you can achieve in the short term and in the long term as well. So no problem with having a sloping field.
Okay, lovely. That's very exciting for you, Rachel. Hopefully that answers your question. Now, I'm whizzing around trying to get as diverse a sort of spread of answers to lovely questions as possible. I'm going to go to Francis, and this may be for Jerry, but the others, if you have an answer, please do chip in. Now, Francis has asked, if you have an unimproved grassland, so no fertiliser grazed previously by sheep and cattle, what's the best way of increasing the number of flowers and legumes? As she said that sowing them isn't very effective.
Well, one of the things is that if you can graze it in the autumn, then graze it with cattle preferably. And actually, some people have used plug plants so that they have germinated in the greenhouse or in polytunnel and then plant them out as plug plants. That gives them a better chance of establishing where there are competitive species around. And the problem with creating meadows is if you've got species like creeping bent or creeping buttercup, which will readily colonize any bare ground you create. So that can cause a problem when you're sowing seeds into small patches that you create. The ideal for creating meadows and sowing it is to create at least 75% bare ground, because research has shown that anything less than that can compromise your germination and persistence of your sown species. So bare ground, preferably sow in the autumn, late autumn. And I say that partly because if you sow in the spring and we have a dry spring as we are having now, then species can be compromised by a prolonged drought, particularly if they're wheat-rooted. So you could lose most of your seedlings under prolonged dry periods. So sow in the autumn, sow into bare ground, and I recommend you start off with some of those species that I listed. Red clover is a brilliant species because it actually has been shown to facilitate the soil to enable other wildflower species to then establish after that. So red clover. And if I've got time, I'll just give you a little chat about what I observed in the Balkans in Croatia, where we have wonderful meadows. And those meadows were actually within a system, an 8-year cycle. They grew oats, or if they were lucky, rye for a year. Then they grew potatoes. They put on fertilizer, but in the form of farmyard manure. But that was usually most of the nutrients were taken up by the crops. Then it was fallowed. Then the farmers, the small farmers, would sow a mix of red clovers and vetches into those, and also lucerne. And that then actually the legumes fix nitrogen. That then enabled the following cohort of species to come in and establish, because I talked about the risks of nitrogen, but there is actually, you can have too little nitrogen in your system for the non-fixing plants. But that system produced meadows that contained up to 40 to 50 species per meter squared. Absolutely amazing. But it was driven by that cycle. So the soils were initially cropped to impoverish the fertility. Then they used the legumes to improve the nitrogen content, the background to all of that was the phosphorus levels were very low. If you have the chance of doing a soil analysis, look at your soil nutrient availability, particularly phosphorus. If it's above 1 or if it's 2 or 3, you've got a problem on your hands. You're going to end up by having domination by some of the more competitive legumes, such as white clover and the grasses.
Thank you, Jerry. Now, speaking of surveying, I wanted to ask Jack this next question from Samantha, who asked a really interesting question that was actually on my mind as well. Can we register to participate in surveys if we're not landowners?
Yeah, so the surveys are primarily focused at people that kind of have a meadow and are part of the More Meadows network, because one of the things you'll need for the surveys, because they are on private land, is permission to do so. Now, I think, Lisa, you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but with the More Meadows network, there is potentially some opportunity for training volunteers to register, and that would be to help out with people who might not be able to complete their own surveys. But yeah, that's the general idea.
Absolutely, Jack. We've got a Train the Trainers Day booked in May specifically for that purpose, so that we can familiarise everybody with the methodology and so that they'll be on hand to help if needed. Yeah.
That's great, thank you. And I think sticking with the kind of public engagement side of things, this is a question that I sort of sprang to my mind as I was listening, and I was struck by Jerry's comment on the cultural and social heritage of these meadows, and that photo is really striking because it feels very nostalgic, that kind of very almost romantic, it feels now, vision of a meadow, especially in Devon. Thinking of the next generation, how can young people with likely little to no land of their own, establish a meaningful connection to meadows, especially people from the county, from Devon, which has such a rich heritage and history of these landscapes? How, given how rapidly our world changed since those more hectic days of working with the land, how would you recommend that they kind of forge their own pathway to engaging with a meadow?
Who are you directing that to, Sophie?
Well, I'll open it to the floor, because I feel I'm interested in kind of, you all have slightly different perspectives. So whoever would like to go first. Lisa.
I'm quite happy to chip into this one. I think it's a really, really important question. And there are a number of routes through which people of any age, and I think any persuasion, can get involved in meadow management. There are a lot of different community initiatives all over Devon. Here in Chagford, for example, the churchyard is a conservation churchyard. We've got a little group that meets every month when we talk about different issues. There are a number of meadow owners who are looking for help of various kinds. There are ways of getting involved. And I think also there are organisations like the Wildlife Trust, like the Dartmoor Preservation Association, who have got meadows of their own, and again are needing help with that. And I think there's no better way of learning than learning alongside those people who are actually managing the sites, because you get a real feel for the needs of a site through the season, the way it responds. It's really important. So yeah, I would say there's a lot of routes in that way. There is also being an influencer in your community, because there is a lot of common land out there. Some of it is managed really positively for nature. Some of it could just be an information thing or a lack of people to help. Yeah, asking questions, getting things going in local communities, I think is really important too. Maybe I'm quite mouthy that way, but you know what I mean.
Thanks, Lisa. Jack, have you got anything to add there?
Yeah, I think there's little things as well. I mean, we've kind of been talking about meadows, and I think the typical thing we've referred to is kind of larger fields and things. So, little verges outside your house or rounded about in Exeter, where I live, and you can sort of take notice of work where kind of wildflowers are being sown. And as Lisa said, there are kind of opportunities with Devon Wildlife Trust. I mean, I don't know if I still classify as a young person. I think maybe I'm just about in that bracket. But something for me was plant identification. So I kind of grew up, loved being outdoors, but you know, I could name a few trees, but that was about it. But actually feeling more connected to the landscape is just taking notice of what's around you. So whether that's the plants that are growing in the cracks in concrete or just on a bit of grass at the side, you don't have to know what they are initially, but just recognizing those differences. And then over time, there's so many good resources now, whether those are plant identification apps, wildflower guides. I mean, I picked my first one up in a charity shop and, you know, just started looking at the pictures. I think that can be really powerful for connecting you with the landscape, but then also becoming an advocate for kind of wildlife and nature in general.
Yeah, definitely. And Jerry, what do you think?
Well, I've also seen a comment about disturbing old meadows. So I'll come to that one in a moment. But first of all, forest schools are, I think, again, an incredible possibility of bringing young people and young people with problems as well in their lives to engage with wildlife, with grasslands, with species richness, and all the issues there. So, yeah, I think there's all sorts of potential. But Lisa and Jack have said that. But could I now just direct back to this comment about someone who was concerned about creating bare ground on old pastures? Absolutely. And power harrowing is not something I'd advocate. Harrowing, chain harrowing, is actually quite useful, so long as you don't go deep and really hack up the soil with power harrowing. The other thing is that when I mentioned cattle grazing or grazing on hay meadows, we found it very important. Not only was it that the cattle hoof prints created small areas of bare ground, but also the cattle, the dung itself, created sort of micro habitats for species to germinate in. And providing the cattle haven't been wormed, when you get this enormous activity, as it had anti-helminthic worming treatment, the cattle dung provided actually amazing seedbeds. And some research we did, and it hasn't been taken up at all really, was we looked at the number of seeds of wildflowers, the European flora, that can pass through either a cow's digestive system or a sheep's digestive system. And we found that over 75% of our European flora can pass through the grazing animal and come out at the back end ready to germinate. And when you get it packaged within dung or sheep's droppings or in cattle dropping, it's an amazing way. And that used to be used for actually creating clover-rich upland meadows. They would fold sheep up the hill to create that. And people in the world are using that technique. We don't in this country. It's so simple. You feed your wildflowers in a grass seed pellet to your animals and then turf them out onto the area you want to reseed.
Fascinating stuff. Thanks, Jerry. Now, we've got time for probably about one more question. And this one comes from Rebecca again. I just thought it would be able to share this one. So Rebecca asks, how does the county wildlife site designation relate to sites of nature conservation interest? Are they the same, or does the sites for nature conservation interest replace it? Jack, I didn't know whether this might tee up your talk on the 1st of May on county wildlife sites nicely.
Yeah, well, I have to admit, I'm not familiar with the term sites of nature conservation interest. So someone else, yeah, Lisa.
Yeah, SNCI is the same as county wildlife site, but in a different county. So different counties have got their own systems for identification of sites that are important for nature, but are kind of a step below SSSIs. And they're called SINCs in some places, they're called SNCIs in some places, and they're called county wildlife sites in some places. So similar kind of thing.
Okay, well, in that case, that was nice and succinct. I think we can squeeze in one more from Rachel. And this one was about surveying. And Rachel did a JNCC Phase 1 habitat survey already in late August last year. Is our survey, or is your survey similar?
Yeah, so there are some similarities. So typically with Phase 1s, you would still be kind of looking at quadrats in places. I think slight differences with ours is that more condensed species list. So yeah, with phase ones, you kind of tend to try and identify as much as possible. We're conscious that not everyone is experienced in botany. Whether you're a beginner, an intermediate, you might not be too confident. So that's why we've sort of condensed the list down, and, you know, prioritized indicator species, and can hopefully have those resources to support it. Yet we also don't really ask you to map the habitat. The main thing for us is that you submit that data, and then we kind of do the habitat analysis from there.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Jack. Well, I wish we had more time, but I'm afraid that's it. So thank you so much to Jack, Lisa, and Jerry for your time this evening, for your insight. It's fascinating stuff in a brilliant way to kick off the Big Devon Meadows Count. So I'm going to wrap up, but thank you so much for your time this evening. Just quickly before you do go, if you'd like to hear more talks from more meadows, the best place to go is to the website. The next one is, as Jack said, 1st of May on county wildlife sites, where he's going to be going into a bit more depth there. That's going to be at 7:30 online. So we'll put the details in the chat here, and you can register and make sure that you attend that one. That's going to be really, really useful. And again, you can also register for the Big Meadow Count via the website while you're there as well. But thank you so much for your time this evening and for your interest, and look forward to following the journey of all of you and all of your meadows this year. So have a lovely evening and a good rest of the week. Thank you so much. Good night.